If you want to check your disk usage, obviously you could always use a program like NC or NCDo, and they do a fairly good job for most things. But the one thing they don't do really well is a visual representation of what's actually happening. So if you run something like NCDo, basically you get a big list of what's happening on your file system. You see, okay, this is the biggest file, this is the second biggest, third biggest, fourth biggest, so on and so forth. And then you get this little bar that says, okay, this is how big the bar is relative to the size of this next file, relative to the size of this next file, so on and so forth. But showing this little bar that's showing what's going on isn't really the best way you can visually describe how big the files are relative to other files. The better way to do it is the way that a lot of graphical utilities do it, and that is by showing basically a bunch of different boxes, and the boxes are going to be different sizes based on the size of the file, as well as also allowing you to do things like free up some disk space. So let's actually go see what it can do. Okay, so if we try to run Diskonaut with no arguments, basically it's going to try to run it from whatever the path that you're currently in actually is. So in this case, if we just run Diskonaut with no arguments, it's going to run it from my home directory. But we can also run it from a separate directory by just running Diskonaut and then passing a path into it. So if we want to run it from, say, my pictures directory, for example. So let's just pass in pictures, and as you can see, now it's going to run it from my pictures. But we're just going to run it from my home just because that's obviously where most of my files are going to be. So if we just run a Diskonaut with no arguments, now the time this is going to take to actually cache all of the files is really going to be dependent on a couple of things. If you run it earlier, it may still be cached. If you have a really fast CPU, obviously it's going to be able to read through everything really quickly. And it's also going to very much depend on the size of the files and how many files you actually have. So on my system, when it's not cached, it takes anywhere in the realm of 30 seconds to a minute to cache every file, but if you're using something with a much slower CPU, it could take considerably longer, but it still seems to be relatively quick. Okay, so what's actually going on here with the size of the boxes? Well, as you can see, the .local directory is 266 gigabytes, which is 46% of my home directory. And the videos directory is 198 gigabytes, which is 35% of my home directory. So basically, the size of the boxes on the screen is going to be how much space they are taking up in the current folder. So right now, the current folder I'm in is the /home/Brodie folder, and this is taking up 46% of that folder, so it's going to take up 46% of the screen. Now, you can probably work out that this isn't everything in my home directory. There's a lot of files here that aren't actually being shown, and anything that's not being shown is going to be contained in this big group right here of X's. So X's are basically small files that are too small to fit on the screen right now. Now, I'll get to those in just a bit. Before we get to that, as you can see, the .local directory, it says, has 64,453 descendants. So what this means is there's this many files inside of the .local directory, as well as all of the folders inside of those folders, and inside of those folders, and so on and so forth, until you get to the last file that is contained in that folder. Now, one thing to also keep in mind is that files and folders are being treated as the exact same thing in this application. So if it says, say, there is 968 descendants, that is 968 files and folders. It's not treating them as separate things. It will color them differently in the application, but when it's counting them, they're going to be treated as the exact same thing. So going back to the smaller files for just a bit, we actually can go and look at them. And the way we do that is by changing our zoom level. And this is also sort of going to change what the meaning of the size of the boxes actually are. So if I go and zoom in by pressing plus, as you're going to see, the size of the videos folder actually has changed. Now it is 64% of the screen, but the size of the folder itself hasn't actually changed. And that's because the way the box sizes are actually being calculated isn't just based on how big they are in the actual home directory itself. At zoom level 0, that is what is being calculated. But when you actually zoom in and some of the bigger files are getting hidden, what is basically being calculated is the size of the folder relative to what else is visible on the screen. So as you can see, the VirtualBox VM also has gotten bigger. This time here at zoom level 0 is only 12%. We zoom in and it becomes 22%. So just keep that in mind. The size of the boxes at anything besides zoom level 0 is going to be relative to whatever is visible on the screen right now. So if we just keep zooming in, eventually we're going to get to the point where we see all of the smallest files contained within my home directory. And I think there's 40 larger files that need to be hidden until we actually get to that point. Now, as you can see, I think that, yep, that's the end of it. So these are all the smallest files contained within my home directory. Now, if this was all the application did, it wouldn't really be that useful. So let's zoom back out a bit. Now, we can actually move around this by either using our arrow keys or using Vim keys, whatever you're more comfortable with. I'm going to use my Vim keys. And if we try to go to my pictures folder and then we press enter on it, basically it's going to take us into that folder. So let's go into another folder and actually go and try to free up some space. So let's go into my screenshots and just zoom all the way in. I'm not really sure how much needs to be hidden until we can actually see the end of it. And I guess it's for some reason not showing all of it. Maybe it's because of my font size. If I zoom out a bit, no, that's actually not letting me zoom in anymore. I actually haven't seen that happen before, so maybe there's a maximum level of 60 larger files for letting you zoom in. For some reason, it's not letting me see any of the smaller files in here. I haven't actually seen that happen before. That's a little odd. Anyway, now that we're here, if we go and press backspace on a file, that's going to let us actually free up some space. So if I go and press backspace on, say, this one right here, it's going to prompt us for a deletion. If I press Y, that's then going to actually go and delete that. And as you can see up the top here, it now says that we've freed 52K. So let's zoom out a bit and free up a bit more space. And I don't really care about any of these files because they're just random screenshots. So this is sort of the main reason why you might want to use an application like this, because obviously you can go and clear up your file system without knowing how big folders are relative to other folders. But if you know how big they are, you know where, I guess, the main pain points are, rather than trying to just stumble around your file system trying to work out what the biggest folders are. If you know exactly where you should be attacking to free up some space, it is going to be much easier to clean some stuff up. Now, if we go and press escape, that's going to take us up to our parent directory, and really this is all that this application actually does. There's not really much else you can do with it. This isn't intended to be a file manager, so you can't go and do things like moving files around, making new files, making new folders, opening up files with your editor, zipping, unzipping stuff, the sort of stuff you normally see in a lot of terminal file managers. This isn't what that is supposed to be. This is just a disk usage navigator and disk usage analyzer. So obviously it's not going to have that functionality, but I still do think this does serve sort of a practical purpose. Now, is this the most practical implementation of disk analysis? Obviously not. It's not intended to be. It's intended to be a visual representation that is sort of lacking with a lot of terminal applications. So obviously, you could always use something like do or NC-do. I realized at the start of the video I called do NC. Someone's going to call me up for that, and I don't feel like going back and re-recording it, but I meant to say do. So obviously, you could always use one of those, or really any other sort of disk usage analyzer, and they'll all do a fairly similar job, but most of them don't really give a good visual representation, and I think that's what sort of sets Diskonaut apart. If you want a visual representation of what's going on your file system, this is probably going to be a pretty good option to go with, because if you're just comparing features between this and all of those other options, it's not like this is lacking features compared to those, it just sort of shows the information in a different sort of interface. Normally, I would also talk about how to do some configuration or some of the options the application has, but in the case of Diskonaut, there's not really anything of note to actually say. There's one other option I didn't mention, and that is the -A option, which is going to show the file sizes rather than their block usage on the disk, but that's the only option that actually exists outside of showing the help menu. And as for configuration, there is no configuration whatsoever. Basically, the application looks as it does, and that is all you get. So if you're using a light theme terminal, it probably won't look great. I remember there being an issue on the GitHub about that, so it might be an issue if you're using a light theme, but stop using a light theme. That's all I can say to you. So I think that's pretty much everything for me. I wasn't expecting this video to be so short, but I guess it happens from time to time. So I think that's pretty much everything for me. But before I go, I would like to thank my supporters: Joachim Corbinian, Andrew Craig, Nathan Montazar, Joseph Peter D. Road, Tony Donald, John Marek, Michael Spagin, Thais, and Zilva. If you want to support my work, there'll be some links down below, as well as links to various other things like my coin tree, which has all of my other support links on it, just because my description has been getting a little too big with links. Also, remember to go check out my podcast, which is just rambling nonsense, available on Library, BitTube, YouTube, and anywhere you listen to audio podcasts. Also, this channel is available outside of YouTube on Library, BitTube, and BitChute. on those platforms, it usually comes out like 2 or 3 hours after it does on YouTube, but I typically prefer people watching on those platforms anyway. You can watch wherever you want, but if you want to support me on the platform that I guess has the best monetization, I would recommend going and checking out my content on Library. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, and I'm out.